I thought I'd do a couple of episodes on Does James Correct Paul? And this is basically a reading from chapter 11 of Jesus' Words Only. And we'll focus today on James' critique of Paul's idea that the law arouses sin. But before I get into that, I just want to show you, those who aren't familiar, who is James in the book of Acts and in the life of the early church? Who is he? In this portion of chapter 11 of Jesus' Words Only, I discuss the status of James in the early church. This section is entitled, James is the head bishop of the church. Why would James be giving an evaluation of Paul's teaching for purpose of a trial? So that was the preface to this was the book of James is decidedly trying to prepare people for a trial. They're going to be trying someone, and he's giving them guidance and giving them doctrine that they need to know about going into that trial. And it's very obvious, and even scholars have noticed it. It's not me. They just noticed he's talking about all kinds of illegal language and give the seating to the poor. Don't treat anybody, don't give status to the rich and let them sit up front in this meeting that's going to take place, this trial. And so we have a whole theory of what that trial was about in the chapter 11. But more importantly, we're going to see why is James' epistle clearly directed at Paul about 11 different topics. And on top of that, he's preparing the people for a trial. You can put the two and two together if you want. But I'm here just to say, what does James say on these issues that directly confront Paul, and how does he support a contrary position to Paul's position? So why would James be giving an evaluation of Paul's teaching for purposes of a trial? Because James was the head of the church at that time. Paul indirectly alludes to this in Galatians 2, verse 9. He quotes a reference, James and Cephas and John, they who were reputed to be pillars, meaning the towering people in the church at that time. Cephas was the Aramaic version of Peter's name. Thus, Paul says the main supports or pillars in Jerusalem appeared to be James. That's the James. He is, by the way, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and John. And incidentally, and I'm not going to bring it up here by proof, I'm just going to tell you the early church had a tradition, an actual epistle that it mentions that Jesus had said just before he departed that the apostles are to go to James, and basically he shall be the one that the authority among them. So he put James over the 12. That was tradition. So that's what it meant to be the bishop. So they could all be equal brothers, and he would be the one who would basically take the status or position of Jesus as being the one they would take guidance from. Cephas, okay, all right. Second, we find in Acts that James takes the position of the final decision maker over and above the apostles on doctrinal issues. So again, we have to look at the dynamics of Acts 15. There's all 12 apostles are there, and they're debating and talking about stuff, but they don't propose anything. They wait for James to make the decision, and he makes the decision what to do with prayer, but he makes it still, nevertheless. So in Acts 15:6, the apostles and elders were gathered together to consider the issue whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised for salvation. After Paul and Peter speak, James gets up in Acts 15:19 and says, I judge. That's the Young's literal. James then spells out exactly what is to be done and all the particulars. A letter is to be written and several specific requirements to be demanded. Robertson's word pictures explains James uses an expression of krino, or to judge, in the first person form. Robertson further explains that this is exactly the form used by a judicial officer. It means I give my judgment. Robert says the implication on James' status is clear. And he says, so Robertson says, James sums up the case as president of the conference in a masterly fashion and with the consummate wisdom for which he is noted. So Robertson is saying he is the president, or he's acting as the president of the group. He is the one who they're looking to make the decision. They provide information, and then he processes it, and he delivers the conclusion. The apostles, including Peter, were all present. So this is me talking, not Robertson. Obviously, they previously had authorized James to exercise such authority on doctrine. In fact, they were evidently waiting for his final ruling. Lastly, the proof we have that James was the head of the church at the time of his epistle comes from abundant external ancient sources. These sources say James was appointed by the 12 apostles as the head over the Jerusalem church. Now, the tradition actually is that Jesus made this appointment and they acknowledged and accepted him as the head, the leader. Because there are some in Christendom who suppose this honor belongs to Peter, we need to review the evidence in depth. The next topic. We will get to the issue at hand in a minute, but we do need to know who James is, and most of us don't really know. The historical sources for James' role. First, Eusebius. He's known as the church. He was a bishop himself, but he was a bishop who's dedicated to providing history of the church. He was born or lived around 260 to 341. And in 325 AD, approximately, he wrote the following in his famous work, Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius is regarded as a conservative early church historian, having at one time himself been bishop of Caesarea in Palestine, or maybe he was most of the time he was writing that book, by the way. Eusebius agrees James was the initial leader of the church after Jesus' resurrection. And he writes, James, the brother of the Lord, to whom the episcopal seat at Jerusalem had been entrusted by the apostles. Ecclesiastical History, chapter 23. What Eusebius says we see occurring in Acts chapter 15. Hegesippus, he was around 120 AD, who lived immediately after the apostles in Palestine, had written a work divided into 5 books called Memoirs. In book 5, he mentions, quote, James, the brother of the Lord, succeeded to the government of the church in conjunction with the apostles. Memoirs of Hegesippus, book 5, quoted by Eusebius. Jerome, the famous translator of the entire Bible into the Latin Vulgate in 405 AD, devotes chapter 2 of his work on famous men to a biography of James the Just. This is another name for the James who's talking in Acts chapter 15. Incidentally, as you read this quote, you will see Jerome is struggling on how this person can be the brother of Jesus, and yet Mary was a perpetual virgin. By the 400s, the Roman Catholic Church was now claiming Mary remained a perpetual virgin. Jerome gives a very odd explanation how James could be the brother of Jesus. Jerome suggests that James is the son of a sister of Mary. The entire effort to make Mary a perpetual virgin is unscriptural and dangerous for a lot of other reasons, but we won't go into it. However, what is important is that Jerome cites Hegesippus for the fact that James was appointed the bishop of Jerusalem by the apostles. Jerome writes, James, who's called the brother of the Lord, surnamed the Just, the son of Joseph by another wife, so he says, as some think. Oh, even says, as some think. He's not claiming it's really true. He just says, as some think. But at least he has the integrity to say that. But it appears to me the son of Mary, sister of the mother of our Lord, of whom John makes mention in his book, after our Lord's passion, at once ordained by the apostles bishop of Jerusalem. Hegesippus, who lived in the apostolic age, in the 5th book of his commentaries, writing of James, says, after the apostles, James, the brother of the Lord, surnamed the Just, was made head of the church at Jerusalem. Likewise, Epiphanius, a bishop in the late 300s, writes of James in the Panarion 29.3.4. He says that, quote, James, having been ordained at once the first bishop, he who is called the brother of the Lord, meaning the physical blood brother of Jesus, we find as well that he is of David's stock through being Joseph's son. To the same effect is Clement of Alexandria, who said the apostles did not pick from their own number, quote, because the Savior had already specifically honored them, but instead chose James the Just as Bishop of Jerusalem. There is thus no question that James is the original head bishop of the Church of Christ. He was appointed by the 12 apostles themselves. That's at least what everybody says. I think also there's since I wrote this in 2005, I came across a secondary work that said that Jesus actually directed the apostles to go to James the Just. Acts chapter 15 gives witness to this, as well as all ancient historical sources. Thus, contrary to a popular misconception, Peter was not the bishop of the Christian church when it first began. Rather, as Acts chapter 15 depicts, in the early period, Peter speaks, but then everyone waits for James to decide the issue. And that's right. Peter's sitting there listening and waiting for James to make the decision. Peter doesn't make the decision. He's not acting as the bishop. Now, I point out this is not to detract from Peter's important role, of course. Around 42 AD, 10 years into James' service as bishop over Jerusalem, Peter founded a church at Rome. Peter was, in effect, its first bishop. Every city in Christendom had its own bishop. Thus, Peter was de facto bishop of Rome, even if some bishop lists omit his name, and they do. But, he founded it, so, anybody who's operating is basically at his authorization. By the same token, Peter's position at Rome 10 years into James' primary position at Jerusalem does not detract from James' role. All right, so let's move on and we'll get to the topic at hand. And I'll pause. Okay, next we will come to James's critique, and he has many critiques that are obviously self-obviously about Paul's doctrines. And so anyone who claims that there's no dispute with it between James and Paul are just simply not taking any time to research this with any depth. Anyway, but let's listen. You'll see an example of where this is true. But more importantly, listen to the truth of what James is saying, not get caught up in like who's Paul and who's James. It's does what he is say, what does James say make sense about what Paul does? In James 1, verse 13 to 14, ASV means American Standard Version, we read, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempts he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death." What is James saying here? God does not tempt anyone to sin. To say so is a blasphemy, an insult of our Creator, to say he would come to you and tempt you to sin. When you sin, it is because you were enticed by your own desires, right? Theologically sound, of course. What did Paul teach? The exact opposite. Paul says this in Romans 7, verses 7 to 13, and this is his most famous epistle and the one you will most hear often and you're to read and almost memorize and take to heart. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. What did he just tell you? He's denying that the law tempts him to sin, but he then says, I wouldn't have known sin, but the law said, don't lust. And had the law not said that, and said, thou shalt not covet, I would not sin. I would not have known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Come on. This is like easy childish. A child would even understand this stuff, how bad it is. But yet your pastors won't tell you. They refuse to tell you the truth about what this passage means. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment. By what? By God's commandment? Yes, by God's commandment. Wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. Wow. So God, knowing your sin nature, decided to give you a law that said, thou shalt not covet. And you say you would not have known. I'm just saying this. He says, I would not have known sin. Look back up here. I had not known sin, but the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. He is saying clearly that but for the law, his sin would never manifested itself. But it was the commandment when it came. That's what caused me to sin. But sin, taking the occasion of the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin is dead. So in other words, if we could just get rid of the law, sin would remain dead and inactive. So the vital element in causing your sin is God sent the law. That's what arouses the sin of lust in your heart, because God said, don't covet. And so when you hear those words, you go, hey, what am I not supposed to covet about? And then you start coveting. That's putting right on God the sole cause and blame for your acting out your sin and breaking God's laws, is that he gives you a law to stop you, and it has the exact opposite intention than what God intends, supposedly. But the consequences, what this really means is God is tempting you. And that's why James is saying God does not tempt anyone. He can't do it. It's not in his nature to tempt you. He may give you a stressful circumstance, but he's not going to make it that it's like it's going to cause you, like you're going to sin just because he's provided a challenge to you. Like Paul himself is a false prophet, I contend. And if he is, God says, I allow false prophets to test you to see whether you love me with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And if you reject the false prophet, you've proven you love me. But if you accept him and you embrace him as if I had spoken through this person, then you do not love me. That's what God says. But you notice something about that? God's only testing your love. He's not necessarily saying it's sinful in itself to accept a false prophet. It's just simply you prove you don't love him. You love this false prophet more than you love God. That's what he says is really going on. And that's not a sin. You can love a false prophet more than God. But what's really going on is God tested you to see if you love him at all. But still, he never says not loving him is a sin. He never says if you don't love me, you sinned. Notice that. He's always left. It's up to you to make your decision. Do you love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul? Will you listen to someone crazily telling you that had the law not come and said, do not covet, and you listen to this and you think this is sensible talk by a religious voice? If you think that about God, that he would ever send someone to talk like this to you, you have got another thing coming. And you do not apparently love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, because nobody can believe this in with the right mind, with any kind of spiritual sense. But yet your pastors all say this is the crowning achievement. This is the jewel of Christianity. The book of Romans is where it's all at. And particularly in chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. This is the heart and soul of the gospel. Also chapter 4. But I digress. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived. So I was alive without the law. I was doing fine. I wasn't sinning. I was not giving into my flesh. But then the law came and I read it. Oh my gosh. And if without the law, I wouldn't have sinned. But then God gave me this law to read and I sinned. Oh, if he just hadn't given me the law. That's what he's saying, ladies and gentlemen. Do you realize what blame he's putting on your Father in heaven? And what else could James be talking about when he says, let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempts he any man. He doesn't tempt you to sin. But I digress again. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, that means that God intended it to give me life, I found to be death. So Paul is saying, I found out on my own, this self-discovery process, that it doesn't work the way God intended, on me at least. But he's telling you this is how it's going to work on all of you. And this is why he's saying the law should be just ejected. Get it out of your heart and soul. The law is what's killing you. The law is what's leading you to sin. And there are people who literally repeat this, and it's a blasphemy of God. I'm telling you, this is the clearest blasphemy you will ever hear in your life. To insult God, tell you something that is a lie like this is off the charts. God will never forgive anyone who talks like this. Every pastor who taught you this pastor exactly as it reads, as if it were truth, are all going to hell, because this is clear-cut insult on God. And he says anybody who does that, anybody who insults my name, my personhood, and contributes to me the desire and the intent and the consequence of my law was to give you that necessary step, that you were already alive without the law, but when I gave you the law, this is what killed you. This is what caused you to sin. God is going to be furious with the person who wrote these words. That's all I can tell you. And you do not want to be on the other end of this stick. This is the most venomous, evil statement you will ever read in any religious writing anywhere. Do not be fooled. I digress. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me. Sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me. And by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy. So I just want to show you what he's doing. Now he's trying to say, well, the law, that my sin deceived me. The law was the agent, the operative tool that did this, but I deceived myself. And that's the only kind, I don't even know if you call it a kind, the only mitigation of all the evil he just heaped on God. And I just want to say this. If you slander God and then you say, I'm going to just throw in something that just kind of gives a little edge that it's some little bit of my own fault. It's not all God's fault. I participated in this. I sinned. But he still says it was sin taking occasion of the commandment, meaning had the commandment not come, I would never have gone there. And he's clear about that earlier. So he's really saying the same thing he said before, but saying in a way that's, I had sin in my heart. I just wouldn't have. But he said earlier, I wouldn't have acted on it had the law not come. So he's still really saying the same thing, but in a nicer way. But it still doesn't mitigate anything, because he isn't contradicting himself. He is saying the same thing in a different way. Sin what did he say? For sin taking occasion by the law, by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law, now here's where this is where people say, oh, he was all about endorsing the law. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and the just and good. My goodness, what kind of God would send me a just and holy law that is the reason, the proximate cause of my sinning? This is what charlatans do. They tell you one thing, and if you believe that, they'll tell you something else, and you're not sure where are they coming from, because they're contradicting themselves. So here, how can a law that had I not here he says, I had not known sin but by the law. So if God's going to send you something holy, how could that thing be the cause of you falling into sin? But that's exactly what he said. So anyway, this is the point. A charlatan and a liar is going to, and a one who's a blasphemer inspired by Satan, is going to give you the first part of this, bury you, make you believe something that is untrue about your God, insulting him, and then he's going to try to peel it back just a little bit so you can't accuse him of anything doing wrong. He's not putting that in there because he wants you to believe the law really is holy, just, and good, because he just told you the law is necessarily the cause of all your sinning. If you do not read this law, which he later calls a letter of death, and a ministry of ministry of death was the law. It had no purpose to give you life. It was only to cause you to die. So God didn't give this to make us righteous or to tell us to learn how to behave properly. No, God didn't do that. He wanted to condemn us all to die and cause us to be eternally damned and separated from him. That's why he sent this. Don't you get it? That's the God you serve. And I don't say this. This is what he's saying. What then that which is good made death unto me? So now he's saying, oh, well then how come the law caused me to die? It was meant for good. God had a good intention. He meant well. But why did it cause me to die? Did he not foresee this? And then he says, well, God forbid it should be that. Well, you just said everything about this confuses us, Paul, because if God sent this law, then he would be doing the very thing you say God would forbid. He wouldn't want to do that. So did he give the law or not? Now, I'm just going to tell you in Galatians, he says God didn't even give the law. Did you know that? Did you know he says God didn't give the law? It was given by angels in Galatians 3:19. He says it was given by angels. And then he says to the Galatians who want to observe Sabbath days, he calls it days and new moons and basically the seasonal holidays, all that in the law. And he says, why? Paul says, why do you want to obey those who are no gods? So the only thing I can come away with is the reason he feels free to insult God, the true God, Yahweh, is he has a secondary belief, a belief that you don't see here stated in Galatians, that God, Yahweh, didn't even give the law. Even though if you read Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, it's God is repeatedly saying, Yahweh said this, and Yahweh said that, and Yahweh says this. I, Yahweh, tell you this, I, Yahweh, instruct you that. It's all in there in the Ten Commandments. But Paul is telling the Galatians, God didn't even give the law on Sabbath. Why do you want to obey those who are no gods? And why do you want to return to bondage to the weak and beggarly elements being angels in both Greek and Jewish thought? But I digress. Let's finish this verse out because it just repulses me to no end. But sin, that it might appear sin, works death in me by which is good. So he's still putting the necessary emphasis is on the good law. The good law, if you read it, it has goodness, but without it, I would never have sinned. You got to remember the whole point is he's saying it's good on the surface of things, but in reality, how it works is it works death in me because of the nature of this good law and my sinning. But without this good law, I would never have sinned, because we can go back here. Is the law sin? God forbid. So he does this twice. He's just very clever. And that's the whole thing again, ladies and gentlemen. He traps you into thinking he is on the side of God, and then he bombs God. It's like a terrorist coming. I'm not here to bomb you guys. And as he's pulling in the nuclear weapon into your little, basement, it says, God forbid you think I was doing that. Okay, bring the bomb further up here. It's coming. I'm going to detonate it in a few seconds. These people won't know what hit them. That's what this is like. This is like somebody fooling you and treating you like a dope. And is he being deliberate? I think it's worse than that. I think there's some sort of sickness in this person's mind to talk like this, to talk out of both sides out of his mouth at the same identical time. And he might even be sincere in both po- positions. He might literally believe that God's law is both good and evil at the same time, or that it's more good than it is evil, or it's more evil than it is good. I would say what he's really saying is it's evil and good. And while it's good, it's evil is what causes me to sin. And so, really, in the net result, you don't want to listen to this law anymore. And that's what he's leading up to. The law is dead and gone, is when you keep going and reading his whole spiel. So he's got to be saying that he's not giving it inherent goodness in its entirety. It has an evil side to it, and he's saying that it's contrary to God's own ordained plan, the evil that it has, as if God is stupid, as if God would give you a law and knowing your nature that would be the sole cause of you sinning, and had he withheld the law from you, you would never have sinned, which is what Paul's saying this God should have done. I mean, if you took what Paul is saying is true, God should never have given us the law. But he gave us the law, Paul. So what are you trying to tell us about God himself? And do you know more than our own God? Are you higher than him that you can judge him like this and put him in a box that makes him look evil and despicable? But that's what he's doing. It's insane. And I can't believe that James is as common as he is. Let no man say when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempts he any man, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed, not by God's law. Do you see? This is the direct answer to this. I guess James decided, I'm going to just write a letter, calm down. Not, if I say this out in public, I'm just going to say it so loud and so boisterously, I won't know when to stop saying this is just horrific stuff. But he did a very calm refutation of Paul. Very calm. The whole epistle is just calmness. I'm Italian. We don't do that. We tell you what we feel about what you're doing. This is outrageous stuff that Paul was writing. So when was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. There's the bookend. But sin, that it might appear sin, works death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. So sin, now I'm going to step back in an objective way of just summarizing what he's saying. Sin would not have caused him to sin had the good law not come. When the good law came and I read it, it said, do not covet. It made me think about coveting. I then sinned, but if the law never come, I would not have sinned. So even though this law was ordained for goodness, it ends up, I found, for me to be evil and bad. And I'm telling you all, this is what I think you should think the same way. And you should take the law out of your life and stop reading the letter of the law, because the letter of the law will kill you just reading it. All right. I'm going to calm down here and just say, you can read this. I strongly advocate everybody to just know that it happened. Somebody wrote something like this. It is never to be repeated again, except to teach someone that the person who wrote this cannot be speaking for God and is an enemy. His words are the enemy of God. Whether he intended to be an enemy or not is a different point. It's not necessary to know. That's the whole thing with false prophets. You don't have to know that they intend to be this way. It's just if they're contradicting God's word, and here they're insulting God's word, then you just know this is somebody you stay away with like a 10-foot pole. You don't even get anywhere near him, and you don't read anything he writes. Even if he writes some things that are good, doesn't change the fact that he writes things that are dangerous to read and bad for your spirit to read and never should be read by anybody ever again. What is Paul saying? I go on. First, Paul very clearly says that he would not have known to lust after women had he not been commanded against doing so. Prior to the time, without the law, sin was dead. This is very obvious, verse 8. Paul then comes about this from the other side, making his point more shocking. Prior to the law, Paul says, I was alive without the law, i.e., spiritual alive. But then the law came and sin revived and I died, verse 9. Paul is clearly saying, the law brought sin to life in him. Without the law, he was living sinless and spiritually, without any temptation to sin. However, when the law came and he read its prohibitions, sin by virtue of the law's commands, inciting in him to lust, occurred. Paul sinned and spiritually died. James must have scratched his head reading this. How can anyone attribute to God in his law the temptation to sin? Yet Paul and his defense explain this is precisely what Paul means. So if you want to read people defending exactly what I'm screaming about, they think it's good. This is a good lesson for all of us to learn about God's law. It's going to tempt you to sin. Read it, but just pray to God. Just don't read the law. Ignore the 10 Commandments. Do not pay any attention to it. You'll say, I've never heard that message. Well, then you should go look at footnote 41. You know what? I decided I'm going to read footnote 41 because it belongs to this section of the article or this chapter. Paulinists admit Paul claims that reading the law arouses sin. Paul Borden's audio online sermon, and he's a very reasonable guy in most ways. I've read him and heard him. It's called The Frustration of Doing Good, is an exposition on Romans 7. Borden, an American Baptist, introduces his sermon by saying, quote, the Apostle Paul eloquently explains how the law causes us to do the very things we don't want to do, clearly accentuating our need for grace. So everything is explained or justified. If it makes you feel the need for grace, just reading the law today probably led you to the verge of sin. And if you want to receive God's grace, put that book down and just confess to God that you're not going to read the law anymore and get encouragement to commit sin. What else are we supposed to conclude? Borden is blunt. Quote, Paul says the law caused his sin to spring to life, make him want to sin. See Christianity Today, which hosted this sermon in 2005 at, so by the way, Christianity Today, would you all agree that's a mainstream magazine? They hosted that sermon at the link I give you there. So now this was in 2005 when I wrote the book. So I don't know if it's still there, but that was what it was at the time I wrote the book. Incidentally, Borden's explanations later contradict Paul, claiming Paul means the law merely incites rebellion when we are told to stop the sin we love. So it incites rebellion when we're told. So what he's saying is we're rebelling but we haven't committed the bad deed. And then we hear the law. It says, don't do that. And then we go, I'm going to go do that. Gives you that last push and you go over the hill. Borden explains we like our ways prior to hearing the law. When the law tells us that we are sinning, we continue in our ways rebelliously. Now, this is something that means he's implying that we went on the path of sin. No. That's not what Paul's saying. I haven't even sinned yet because I haven't read the law, is what Paul says, is in his own experience, his own explanation of his own life. In Borden's spin, but here's what Borden is saying, and I'm explaining or summarizing it. In Borden's spin, the law did not cause the sin to start. In this manner, Borden's spin contradicts Paul, for Paul says he did not know to lust for women until he read the law's command against doing so. In other words, Paul hadn't even conceived of the action that was going on here. At least that's what he wants you to believe. That's what he said. Paul says he was previously living spiritually alive. Paul and his spin Paul to prevent exposing his blasphemies. That's what ends up happening. It's like they just do everything they can to deflect any shame falling on his name, which I don't know how you can do that. So let's continue. However, Paul knows what he is saying and knows we will object. So Paul twice does a, quote, God forbid hand wave. That's what I call it. Romans 7, verse 7 and 13. Paul takes what he has just said and claims, God forbid you should think he is saying what he is otherwise clearly saying. Yet, despite the God forbid message, Paul leaves you, the reader, with only words to support the view that the law tempted him to sin. Listen to the hand wave in Romans 7:13. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. This quote reveals Paul senses the blasphemy of saying the law which is good was made death to me. So he says, if you think that were true, God forbid. Yet that is precisely what Paul has just said, and then immediately repeats. He goes back to what he was saying just before, adding the postscript, by the commandment, that's the law, sin became exceedingly sinful. End of quote. Paul was not being equivocal on that point. That is what Paul said backwards and now forwards. Paul gives himself an out from making a blasphemous statement by saying, in our perception, not in God's, by saying that if you think he is saying the law, which is good, made, quote, made death to me, God forbid. However, Paul then does not explain how we are supposed to square what he previously said with his God forbid statement. He uses mumbo jumbo of impenetrable words that you are somehow to think answer your concern. He says this in 7:13. But sin, that it might appear sin working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. End of quote. Romans 7:13. Those are Paul's only words to take the sting out of saying the law tempted him to sin. Rather, it appears to be reinforcing his prior blaming his sin on the law. He says, by means of the good, that means the law, and by the commandment, sin became exceedingly sinful. What does that mean? It appears to be repeating what Paul just said. God forbid you should think he is what he means. Paul reduces his words into pure mumbo jumbo. He seeks to dumbfound the reader into thinking your natural concern that Paul is uttering blasphemy has somehow been addressed, yet it never happens. In response, James simply trashes the entire discussion in James 1, verse 13 to 14. One quick jab, and Paul's ideas are again refuted. And this whole chapter goes through all the refutations of James, of the statements of Paul. Okay, I hope this helped edify you and warn anybody who's on the fence about Paul. You cannot read him. You read all the nice verses, and he has a lot of very good, flowery, rhetorically wonderful statements. I don't dispute that. But he has this horrible stuff. And so it's like you're walking into a minefield where, if you stay along where the flower and the roses are on the edges, you're okay. But if you go anywhere, try to go fast through this stuff, you're going to end up falling into a blasphemy yourself, commit the blasphemy, and then you are never going to heaven. So do you want to walk around this minefield ever again? I trust you will not do that. I mean, so it's like it's only useful to help those people who are trapped by this man's logic. And to the only reason you study it is to help others to be free of this man. That's the only value Paul has, to help people test their love of God by letting them make that decision themselves. You can't make anyone reject Paul. You have to allow people to make this decision on their own. It's going to be it's a spiritual rupture that you're when you became a Christian, you were told you have to accept Paul, and you let him in the door spiritually. And unfortunately, you were given the wrong advice. And now by the way, that is not the advice of the original church. The original church, I have article and proof after proof that the original church, according to Ambrose the Aster in a book commentary on 1 Corinthians, said the 12, and he says, matter of fact, the 12 had decided he was a false apostle and rejected him. But the Corinthians, they accept Paul because they see his signs and wonders and his good works. And he's applauding Paul, but he's acknowledging the fact that was well known in the early church that you and I don't hear about, because why? It's suppressed, because it went through the Constantinian purge, and that's what I call it. The censorship this church went through because of Constantine included protecting Paul, because Paul was the one who did away with the law, including the Sabbath. That was a barrier to Constantine's desire to have a sun worship, to have us change from Shabbat, Saturday, to Sunday, the day to worship the venerable sun in the sky as our God. Okay, everybody, I hope that helps you. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.